He had never imagined life could unravel so quickly. One moment he was holding on barely, and the next he was broke, lost, and exhausted in a way that no amount of sleep could cure. His pockets were empty, but worse than that, his spirit felt hollow. The refrigerator was quiet, almost mocking him with its emptiness. Bills piled up like enemies waiting at the door, and his phone buzzed with reminders he didn't want to face. The world around him seemed to move forward. Friends talking about plans, colleagues celebrating small successes, while he stood frozen in place, unsure if he could even take the next step. It wasn't just the lack of money that weighed on him. It was the loss of direction. He once had dreams, goals, even a sense of purpose. But now, every morning felt like a cruel reminder that he was stuck in survival mode. And the exhaustion was deeper than physical tiredness. It was the kind of fatigue that seeps into your soul, making you question if there's any point in trying again. But somewhere in the middle of that darkness, he remembered a line he had read once, in a book he had almost forgotten. "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Seneca's words. At first, they felt distant, almost meaningless compared to his reality. But slowly, they began to echo. Was it possible that the worst prison was not his empty wallet or his uncertain future, but the fear and despair he fed with his own thoughts? That night, sitting alone with nothing but silence for company, he decided to try something radical. He would stop waiting for his circumstances to change before he changed himself. He would begin, broken as he was, tired as he was, with nothing but the smallest step forward. Because if the Stoics were right, the power to rebuild wasn't out there. It was already within him. He carried the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. Even after 8 hours in bed, he woke up heavy, his mind clouded with the same unanswered questions. How did it all fall apart so quickly? How do I even begin again? The truth was, being broke wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. Every time he opened a bill he couldn't pay, he felt a little smaller. Every ignored message from people he owed became another crack in the walls of his confidence. And being lost wasn't just about direction. It was about identity. Who was he now? Stripped of titles, stripped of status, stripped of the comfort he once thought was permanent. But the worst of it all was the tiredness. Not the kind that rests with a nap, but the soul-deep fatigue that whispers, "You're finished. Don't even bother trying." That voice was his constant companion. It was during one of those mornings that he stumbled upon another teaching from the Stoics. Epictetus, once a slave, once powerless, had written, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." At first the words felt like an insult. How could reaction matter more than reality? But then something clicked. If reaction mattered, then perhaps he wasn't as powerless as he thought. Perhaps even broke, even lost, even tired, he still had a choice. So that day he didn't aim for miracles. He didn't try to solve everything at once. He simply made one choice: to keep moving. It wasn't glamorous. No one noticed. But in that small, invisible act, he began to reclaim what the world had tried to steal: his agency. He didn't rebuild his life with a bold leap. He rebuilt it with something far less impressive: a single, ordinary step. That morning, he decided he wouldn't spend the entire day drowning in self-pity. He would do one thing, just one, that moved him forward. It was as simple as opening his notebook and writing down what he could still control. Not what he had lost, not what was impossible, but the few things that were still his to command: his actions, his words, his choices. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control, the discipline of separating what belongs to you and what doesn't. And when he applied it, he saw that while the world had stripped away many things, it hadn't stripped away everything. He could not conjure money from thin air, but he could manage how he responded to the lack of it. He could not erase betrayal or rejection, but he could choose not to be defined by them. That day he made a call he had been avoiding. His hands trembled, his voice cracked, but he did it. That call didn't fix his situation overnight, but it was proof that he could still act, proof that he could still shape his future even in small ways. And here's what he began to realize. The smallest actions, repeated daily, build momentum. And momentum, once started, is almost impossible to stop. He didn't need to rebuild his entire life in 1 week. He only needed to stack enough small victories until one day, the weight no longer felt impossible. The Stoics believed that life's hardships were not punishments, but training. Seneca once wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body." At first those words sounded harsh, but the more he reflected, the more sense they made. When he looked back on his life, he realized the moments that had shaped him most were never the easy ones. Growth had never come during comfort. Growth had come through fire. And perhaps now, broke, lost, and tired, he was in the middle of the fiercest training ground of all. So he began to reframe his struggle. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he asked, "What is this teaching me?" That simple shift changed everything. The unpaid bills taught him resourcefulness. The loneliness taught him empathy. The exhaustion taught him discipline. Each challenge carried a lesson, but only if he was willing to see it. And with each lesson learned, he felt less like a victim and more like a participant in his own story. One of the hardest lessons he learned was that even when life strips you of nearly everything, one thing always remains: your ability to choose your response. Epictetus, who had once lived as a slave, understood this truth better than most. He taught that freedom is not found in wealth, power, or circumstance. It is found in mastery of the self. And in those dark days, that teaching became his anchor. When despair told him to stay in bed, he chose to rise. When shame told him to hide, he chose to face the day. When fear told him not to try, he chose to take the smallest step forward anyway. Each choice was small, but together they formed a pattern, a rhythm of resilience. The world measured his worth in money, status, and success. But he began to measure it differently, in courage, in discipline, in the quiet victories no one else could see. By those measures, he was not broken. He was training, and slowly, the fog began to lift. He soon realized that discipline wasn't about punishing himself, but about protecting himself. Left unchecked, his mind wanted to spiral, to think of everything he had lost, to replay every failure, to drown in the noise of what if. But discipline gave him structure, and structure gave him peace. So he built small rituals, waking up at the same time each day, no matter how heavy his body felt, writing in his notebook each morning, even when his thoughts were tangled and messy, taking a walk outside, no matter how gray the sky seemed. These were not glamorous acts, but they were anchors. The Stoics believed in the power of habit, that the character of a man is shaped not by what he does occasionally, but by what he does consistently. And as he practiced these habits, something shifted. His days no longer felt like chaos. They began to feel like practice. There were still days when he stumbled, times when the weight of everything threatened to pull him back under. Old habits whispered, old fears returned, and some mornings he woke up wondering if any of this effort was worth it. But then he remembered something Marcus Aurelius once wrote: "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." The very obstacles he hated were not interruptions to his progress. They were the path itself. So he chose perseverance. Not the kind that looks glamorous, not the kind that earns applause. Perseverance to him was showing up for another day of discipline, even when he didn't want to. It was writing another line in his notebook, making another phone call, walking another mile. It was learning to embrace the grind, to see consistency as a form of courage. Each time he pushed forward, even weakly, he proved to himself that his circumstances didn't own him. His effort, not his outcome, became the measure of his worth. What surprised him most was that the rebuilding didn't announce itself with trumpets. There was no single morning when he woke up and suddenly felt whole again. The transformation was silent, almost invisible, unfolding in the rhythm of ordinary days. He began to notice it in the smallest details. The way his hands didn't tremble anymore when he opened the mail. The way he could walk into a room without carrying shame like a heavy cloak. The way his voice grew steadier each time he spoke about his plans. He wasn't rich. He wasn't free of problems. But he was no longer the same man who had once been paralyzed by fear. Pain had shaped him, but it hadn't destroyed him. And in that shaping, he found something far more valuable than comfort: resilience. One evening he sat at his table with nothing more than a notebook, a candle, and a quiet mind. He had no fortune to boast of, no grand achievements to parade, but for the first time in a long time he didn't feel poor. He felt rich in something deeper. The Stoics had taught that true wealth was not gold or silver, but virtue, courage, wisdom, justice, and self-discipline. These were the treasures no thief could steal, no fire could burn, no storm could wash away. And in those moments, he realized he had been gathering these riches all along. By these measures, he was wealthier now than he had ever been in times of comfort. He didn't finish his journey with riches piled high or applause echoing in the distance. His victory was quieter, deeper, and infinitely more powerful. One morning, as sunlight spilled gently through the window, he sat with a cup of coffee, no longer feeling the familiar weight of dread in his chest. The world around him hadn't become easier. Bills still arrived, responsibilities still pressed on him, and fatigue still visited now and then. But something had changed. He was no longer afraid. The man who had once been broke, lost, and tired was no longer defined by those words. He had become someone else, someone stronger, steadier, and wiser. He finally understood that rebuilding wasn't about getting back what was lost. It was about becoming someone new, forged by the fire of hardship. And in that quiet victory, he discovered peace.